I never received an invitation to my brother's wedding, so I decided to plan a trip instead. When I asked about it, my mother simply said, "Sorry, dear, this event is only for the closest people." Hearing that hurt, but I chose to move on and enjoy my time away. Then the wedding was suddenly canceled because of a serious debt problem. That's when my whole family started calling and begging me for help, but by then, it was already too late. Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own house, an afterthought in the lives of the people who raised you? That was my reality for years, and the breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in Brooklyn. My brother, the family golden boy, was getting married, and I was explicitly told I was not invited because it was just for family. That single sentence erased me, but they made one fatal mistake when they left me out. They assumed that because I had always been the quiet, reliable one, I would stay that way forever. But that was the day I realized that being invisible has its own kind of power, and I finally decided to use it. This isn't just a story about being excluded. It is about the quiet, terrifying strength of saying no when the people who erased you suddenly come crawling back because they need you to fix their mess. The phone call began with a silence so heavy I could feel it through the receiver, that specific kind of stillness that precedes a seismic shift in your life. I was in my apartment, struggling with a stubborn coat button, when my mother called. Her voice was brittle, stripped of any warmth, and she delivered the blow with a chilling indifference. "Jenny," she said, "you are not invited to Mark's wedding. It is just family, dear." I stood frozen in my living room, the world narrowing down to the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own shallow breathing. I was his sister, his only sister, yet in her eyes, I had been successfully partitioned off from the people I was supposed to belong to. When I managed to ask for an explanation, she brushed me off, claiming they wanted an intimate event, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than blood. Before I could even process the humiliation, my phone chirped with a message in the family group chat. It was Mark, my brother, confirming the guest list was closed and that there would be no extras. He did not even address me by name. It was a public decree of my irrelevance, a digital shunning that left me breathless. I sat on the edge of my bed, the worn quilt beneath me feeling like the only solid thing in a room that suddenly felt like a cage. I had spent my entire life being the scaffolding for Mark's successes, the one who worked in the shadows while he stood in the spotlight, but this was a new level of cold. They were planning a grand celebration in New Jersey, filled with laughter and light, and I was not only uninvited but unwanted. The anger did not come as a storm, it came as a deep, freezing resolve. I looked around my apartment and realized that I was tired of being the permanent backup character in their narrative. I did not scream, I did not call to beg for an invite, and I did not reach out for validation. I simply shut down the part of me that still craved their approval. I waited until the early hours of the morning, when the city outside was finally quiet, and I opened my laptop. I searched for flights, landing on Portland, Oregon, because it felt like the farthest point from the life they had constructed for me. I booked a ticket for noon, packed a bag with the few things I loved, and left the apartment without a single note. Arriving in Portland felt like stepping out of a suffocating suit of armor. The air was cool and smelled of pine and rain, and for the first time in memory, I was not defined by my last name or my position in a family hierarchy. I stayed in a small, creaky inn behind a local bookstore, and for the first few days, I did nothing but walk. I wandered through the city with no destination, letting the damp weather wash away the lingering bitterness of home. I was no longer the sister who was expected to write the essays, host the parties, or bail anyone out of a financial jam. I was just Jenny, a person who could exist without serving a purpose for someone else. By the third day, the distance began to give me a clearer perspective on the group chat I had been trying to ignore. From my quiet sanctuary, I watched them through the screen like a ghost haunting their digital periphery. The family group chat, once dormant, was now frantic with forced energy. Mark and his fiancée were posting updates about their wedding preparations, but the photos told a different story. In the background of their staged happiness, there were glimpses of stress, piles of bills, calculators, and legal documents scattered across my parents' dining room table. A calendar on the wall, visible in a casual snapshot, showed a red-circled deadline for a loan payment. The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact. My family was not just planning a wedding, they were in the middle of a financial collapse. And the reason they needed me, the reason my exclusion felt so calculated, was beginning to make sense. They needed someone with perfect credit to save them, to sign for a loan that would bridge the gap between their pretenses and their reality. They had pushed me aside for the big day, but they had fully expected me to be there to handle the check. Watching them squirm from 3,000 miles away felt like a strange, cold justice. I wandered into a local bookstore and met Clara, a woman who seemed to understand everything about my situation without me ever having to speak a word of it. She pulled me into a world of misfits who valued authenticity over status. At her dinner party, surrounded by people who did not care about my pedigree or my ability to solve problems, I felt a spark of belonging that I had never found at my parents' dinner table. I spent my nights in Portland realizing that I did not need to be the glue that held their crumbling house together. Back home, the messages started to arrive with greater frequency. My mother's voice in the voicemails transitioned from a faux sweet inquiry about my safety to a sharp, panicked demand for my help. They needed my signature, they needed my credit, and they needed me to play my role as the reliable daughter one last time. As I listened to my father plead with me about how this was for family, I sat in a sun-drenched cafe and watched the rain, feeling nothing but a profound, calm detachment. They had written me out of their lives, and in doing so, they had inadvertently freed me from the obligation to save them from their own failures. I deleted every message, closed my laptop, and decided that for the first time in my life, I was going to put myself first. There is a specific kind of silence that feels like liberation. It is not the empty, aching void I used to fear. It is the rhythmic, steady hush of the tide, a promise that the world keeps moving regardless of my family's drama. After days of hiding, I finally powered on my phone. It vibrated with a desperate, frantic intensity, overflowing with missed calls and messages. My mother's name dominated the screen, followed closely by Mark's. They weren't calling to check on my well-being. They were calling because they had realized, too late, that I was no longer there to serve as their safety net. I scrolled through the messages, my thumb hovering over each one. The phrases "we need you," "after all we've done for you," "this is serious" landed with the weight of spent lead. They spoke of the venue demanding payment, of the humiliation they faced, and of Mark's sudden, sharp realization that his life was unraveling. Every word was wrapped in the same old entitlement. My mother's voice in the voicemails wasn't filled with regret or a genuine desire to reconcile. It was thick with a rising, irreversible panic. They weren't mourning the loss of a daughter or a sister. They were mourning the loss of their control. I didn't answer. I didn't offer a justification for my absence, nor did I provide the half-hearted reassurance they craved. Instead, I set the phone to silent, tucked it into a drawer, and began writing a list of the things I would no longer accept. I was done with conditional love and the exhausting performance of being the reliable one for people who didn't even know me. The news of the canceled wedding arrived in the family group chat like a ghost haunting a graveyard. There were no emotional phone calls, just a screenshot of a post from Serena's mother declaring that the wedding was postponed indefinitely. The chat, once filled with forced cheer, became a digital vacuum of confusion and blame. When I finally checked, even Mark's attempts to frame the failure as a minor hiccup couldn't hide the truth. Serena had scrubbed her life of his existence. I learned through a cousin that my mother had been seen crying on the porch when the vendors came to collect what was owed. It was a spectacular collapse of a life built on expectations rather than reality. My mother's next voicemail was a masterclass in deflection. She blamed me for everything, claiming that if I had just signed the papers, the disaster could have been averted. It was surreal. I hadn't destroyed their plans. I had simply stopped being the fuel for their fire. They had tried to build a dream around me while explicitly leaving me out of it, and when the foundation failed, They looked for someone to blame for the ruin. I sat on my balcony in the cool Portland air, listening to the city hum with a life that was authentic and unscripted. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt finished. Life in Portland had become my sanctuary. I spent my days surrounded by people like Clara and Mo, who valued my presence for no reason other than that I was there. They didn't need me to fix their problems or co-sign their debts. They just wanted to share a meal or a laugh. One afternoon, while sitting around a fire pit, Clara told me she was glad I showed up. It was the simplest statement, yet it moved me more than anything my family had ever said. It was an acknowledgement of my existence without a requirement for my labor. A week later, the silence from my family remained unbroken. I realized that my departure hadn't just been a trip, it was a permanent redirection. I booked a flight to Iceland, choosing a destination that was entirely for me, a place where I could stand in the quiet and breathe. When I returned to Brooklyn briefly to pack up my apartment, I didn't plan on telling them I was back. But they were waiting. I heard the buzzer, and there they were, standing on the sidewalk in the rain, my parents and Mark, looking haggard and smaller than I remembered. I didn't want to let them into my space, so I went down to the lobby. They looked like people who had lost their way, clutching onto the hope that I would be the compass to lead them back to normalcy. My mother spoke of mistakes, and my father mumbled about how they thought I didn't need them. Mark, red-eyed and desperate, finally admitted the truth. He had counted on me to fix things. They weren't there for a reconciliation. They were there for a signature. They were there to see if I was still broken enough to be useful. I looked at their tired, grasping faces and felt a profound sense of clarity. I didn't scream and I didn't argue. I simply picked up my suitcase, walked toward the elevator, and started to leave. My mother's voice trailed after me, a desperate echo in the hallway, but I didn't look back. The door to that chapter was closed, and for the first time, I was the one holding the key. I did not turn around. I simply pressed the elevator button, watching the metal doors slide open with a soft, final hiss. Behind me, my parents and Mark remained standing in the hallway, a trio of silhouettes still sodden from the rain, still clinging to the wreckage of a life they had built on the assumption that I would always be there to sweep up the shards. They did not move to follow me. As the doors began to close, I caught my mother's gaze one last time. There was no bitterness in me, no desire to lash out or seek vengeance. I didn't smile and I didn't shed a tear. I offered only a small, firm nod, a quiet acknowledgement of our history. It was a gesture that said everything. I heard you, I see you, and I understand who you are. But I am not coming back. The doors sealed shut, locking their world away from mine. As the elevator descended, I looked at my own reflection in the mirrored panel. For the first time in my life, I saw a woman I truly respected. I wasn't defined by my capacity to forgive them or my willingness to sacrifice my stability to fix their mistakes. I was defined by the fact that I had finally chosen myself. Outside, the Brooklyn rain was still falling, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt cleansing, a cold, sharp reminder that the air was finally clear. I stepped onto the street, my suitcase light in my hand, and walked toward the idling cab at the curb. Iceland would be there waiting, a destination for the person I was becoming rather than the one I had left behind. Tonight, I didn't need to be anywhere else. I just needed the wind on my face, the low, steady hum of the city, and the comforting realization that I was no longer an echo in their house. I had walked through a door that I never had to open again. The weight of their expectations had been replaced by the quiet, exhilarating terror of true freedom. As the cab pulled away from the curb, I left the streetlights and the shadows of my old life in the rearview mirror. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter, one that I would write in my own ink, on pages that no one else had the power to tear out. I was no longer the secondary character, the reliable daughter, or the invisible ghost in the family album. This was my story now, and for the first time, it was exactly what I wanted it to be. Take care, thanks for watching, subscribe for more.